Chapter 18.5 Interlude. Tapping his fingers in time with the music echoing around his cell, Tyrael walked his empty tray to the collection bin at the door. His meal still followed a rotation, but it now took more time to cycle through his meal options. And even when the cycle repeats, there is variety. Last week, this selection was served with thin squares. This week, it was thick triangles. The song ended as he slid the bin shut, and the next song made him frown. With a sigh of disgust, he strode back over to the MP3 player. With a few taps of the controls, he removed the song from his main playlist and added it to the special playlist of songs he didn't like. It had no special label. He didn't know the written language, but in his head he called it the list of senseless noise. Why, do they even consider that music? He wrinkled his nose in disgust. Their tune is bland repetition, and not even the translation spell can make sense of the mumbling. The low hum of the bass string instrument filled the room as the next song played. Satisfied, he set the MP3 player on his pillow and a single motion folded himself down to sit cross-legged next to the bed. With an almost contented sigh, he cleared his mind and settled into his daily meditation and mana collection. His pool was still pitifully small, far too minuscule to do anything of consequence, but it was steadily growing larger. Contemplating his meditation as the song ended, he stood and stretched. The music shifted to an upbeat piece featuring drums and wind instruments that stirred him a desire to move. If only I had more space to exercise. He barely finished the thought when the locks of the door rattled. He reached over and paused as the music of the gods entered, and followed the familiar routine. 1,002 steps, 26 turns, and 1,016 enki of waiting later, the door to the interrogation room opened, and John walked in. Good morning, Tyrael, John said, setting out the notebook and folder in the same order he always did. Good morning, John. Tyrael made a note of the rough time of day, closed inside the compound. He sensed the time was becoming skewed. He thought that it was closer to evening than morning. The meal rotated, but I had not quite 7 days instead of a proper 9-day week. Doesn't help. I trust that you are well. Tyrael nodded in answer. And how have you been enjoying your MP3 player? Very much, John. I appreciate you getting it for me. It is nice to have something to break up the interminable silence. He smiled. You even managed to produce a few pieces that are barely passable as music. I'm glad that we could produce something that satisfies your lofty standards of culture. Oh, I would hardly go that far, John, Tyrael said with a bemused smirk. It is still a far cry from anything even the basest elf would call culture. John chuckled. If you say so. He flipped open his notepad. Have you given any thought to the type of songs that you would like to have more of? Yes. Tyrael nodded. Remain placid. Do not seem too eager. I created 3 playlists. One is all the music on the MP3, and the other are songs that I find particularly tolerable, and the other is a list of nonsensical noise that is an insult to the concept of music. John nodded, making a note in his tablet. I would like more of a tolerable list, particularly the works of the one called Beethoven, and ask that you remove the senseless noise. He paused. I advise that you attempt to destroy all record of them. Your species would certainly be better off. John smirked. I'll certainly pass on your recommendations, he said, writing a longer passage in his notepad. Setting pen and pad down, he looked at Tyrael. You know how this works, though. If I'm going to convince my superiors to let you add to your music collection, I need to give them something in return. We have talked so much, John, I'm not sure what more I could tell you. You're 10,000 years old, Tyrael. We've only known each other for a few weeks. I highly doubt that you've told me everything that you know. I sometimes forget how fleeting your existence is, he said. Not every millennium brings something new, you know. What about your mage towers? Is there anything else you can tell me about them? How fast they can travel? Only at modest walking pace when the shield is up, he said. It takes fine control to extend the shield all the way to the ground without interfering or leaving a gap that could be exploited. He smirked. But you already knew that. With the shield down, they can move quite quickly, as fast as a charging Quishy. Faster if the mages have particularly strong stomachs. He took a deep breath. On the march, over distance, they can keep up with the trotting Quishy, and can pull enough mana from surrounding trees to maintain that speed in a forest without tapping into the mana stalls. John made several notes, then nodded for him to continue when Tyrael raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Not good enough, then. He repressed an internal sigh. We have several stables of towers, he shrugged. I do not know exactly how many are in each, nor their exact locations, but we maintain some hundreds in reserve, he snorted. Not that this matters too much of our archmages, who insist on having their own custom tower constructed to their own specifications, he chuckled. Depending on the need and the mage, they sometimes get their wish. Sometimes they get one that matches their unique demands pulled from the stables. John scribbled more notes on his tablet. How do your towers pull mana from the trees? They give it freely to any elf that asks for it, Tyrael said, smirking. Even the trees know their proper place. Your pitiful people can't even live up to the standards of a simple tree, he added, shaking his head. Shaking his head, John refused to rise to Tyrael's bait, eliciting a smile from the elf. What is the difference between a mage and an archmage? Some would say the few tens of thousands of years of knowledge and experience, Tyrael snorted. But any archmage actually worth their title knows that time alone is not sufficient measure of power and ability. He shook his head. To be a true master of magic, as with any skill, takes great effort, dedication, and no small measure of talent. He leaned forward. Spending 20,000 years practicing a thing doesn't count for much if you can only practice it once or twice a year. And practicing a thing 20,000 times doesn't count for anything if you practice wrong. He leaned back in his chair. Even perfect practice only counts for so much without experience or practical application, he sighed, shaking his head. Every archmage has an insufferable ego. Some are better deserved than others. Are you an archmage? Ha! No, Tyrael shook his head. I told you before, John, I am a gemblade, he said, straightening his spine. John raised an eyebrow, making a note in his pad. But you were wielding a mage staff when we captured you, in addition to your gemblade. I wield a gem staff, yes, he said, with a nod, and I dare say that I could challenge many supposed archmages who has barely dared to tread outside the Prelina. But I am not a mage. He shook his head. Not in the proper sense. Then every gemblade also wields a gem staff. Tyrael scoffed. Hardly. The effort of crafting a single mana gem would likely kill most elves, never mind a second. He leaned back with a smirk. I am a polygem, one of the few elves with the capability to craft a second gem who has dared to make the attempt. Could you make a third? With a snort, he shook his head. I might be supremely confident in my abilities, John, but not even the most incompetent, arrogant archmage would actually dare make that attempt. We give part of ourselves to his creation of a mana gem. Creating the first is a harrowing experience, the second 100 times more so. Creating a third is legendary accomplishment that is almost always ended in cataclysmic failure. Almost always. John raised an eyebrow over his notepad. Tyrael rolled his shoulders. There have been maybe half a dozen successes in all of Elven history, and most of those are shrouded in ancient myths and legends of the chaotic times before the Empire was formed. John nodded, scrawling another note into his tablet. The questions continued for another hour before John tapped his pen on the tablet and folded the cover over the paper, signaling the end of the session. Tyrael was better able to suppress his disappointment that the day's entertainment was over as they exchanged their parting pleasantries. With more than just mind-numbing silence awaiting him in his cell, he felt like the closer to his normal self. 929 Enki later, the gods returned. His journey back to his cell was 915 steps, with 31 turns. Returning to his cell, he immediately noticed that his MP3 player had been moved. It took considerable effort to follow the routine of having his shackles removed and wait for the gods to leave. As soon as he heard the locks rattle on his door, he hurried to his bunk to retrieve the device. Pressing the button to turn it on, the screen lit up with a familiar chime. His playlists were still there, but two had been renamed to like and dislike. Simple and crude, but what more could I really expect? Another playlist had also been added. The device's voice now read new. Inside, he found 20 new songs from the musicians on his like list. and 30 more songs from musicians he didn't recognize. Sitting down in his bunk, he set this new playlist to shuffle and hit play. The music started, and he leaned back with a smile. End of chapter. The algorithm reckons you should be watching this video next, and I recommend that you should be always watching my video. So, click with energy! And yes, clicking that does help the channel. Thank you very much. I just quickly want to thank the Tier 5 patrons and channel members: Alithia Barkey, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Albard and Guster, Arcadian, Lord Azrekahl, and Joachim Backer.